Getting a copy of the latest best-selling book is as easy as going to the mall or your local library. However, it hasn't always been this simple. Before the invention of the printing press, books were made by hand, copied page for page, word for word, and letter for letter. That meant only the wealthiest could afford books. Since books were a sign of substantial affluence, people who owned them wanted to make sure they were appreciated by everyone who saw them. Like having a nice car or watch today, books were a status symbol.
One of the things about an illuminated manuscript, because it was so expensive to produce, that was a way that the Middle Ages engaged in one of their favorite pastimes, which is, I like to call it conspicuous consumption. If you think of modern American society, modern Western society as interested in conspicuous consumption, as I like to put it in class, we ain't got nothing on the folks in the Middle Ages.
Since these early books were so expensive and difficult to produce, their owners wanted them to look as ostentatious as possible. In order to do this, books showcased hand-drawn illustrations and paintings. This is called illumination.
Illumination generally refers to the imagery. However, it can also we make reference to illuminated letters within the text, the body of the text, and that's exactly what they are. They're letters that were singled out using design and color. Generally, the first letter of a very important word in the first line or segment of a very important part of text. So you have these illuminated letters, and then illuminations primarily, with regard to them, we're referring to what some folks might call illustration today, but there's a difference there. But the pictures within a text.
Not all of these early texts were illuminated. A surprisingly small percentage of the writings were actually embellished with art. That's why those works are so important to today's scholars.
When someone bothered to illuminate a manuscript, that would imply all kinds of things to anybody physically looking at that piece of vellum. The parchment. And a lot of that has to do with how expensive it is and fancy and, ooh, look what we have here.
These were luxury items too, we have to bear in mind, and monasteries in particular, as they became wealthy and prestigious, they wanted these things. So important texts that were destined maybe to be the property of an abbot or a bishop or a king, you bet they would have been illuminated and quite a bit of attention and luxury given to them. And you can almost rest assured if you encounter a beautifully illuminated manuscript, this wasn't done just for the daily use of the monks or a completely utility type text. It was done for display and ostentatious use and that kind of thing. But no, they weren't all illuminated.
Matter of fact, that's one of the things that makes illuminated manuscripts so interesting. We have examples of texts of everything from literally grocery lists in the Middle Ages to copies of romances. For example, Sir Thomas Malory's text exists only in one manuscript, and there's no illumination on it.
Creating many masterpieces to fit inside of a book was no easy feat. They had to be carefully planned and executed so that the splendor of their illumination could be fully appreciated.
Most of the paints are what we would refer to as tempera. Now that's not the powdered school paint that you and I used as kids, and I painted my hair or whatever in the 5th grade with, but very similar. It's a powdered pigment. In most cases it was suspended or became mixable in either egg yolk or egg white, and then that could be diluted with water. It's applied generally in opaque passages. It's not really used as a watercolor, which would be more transparent. And then, of course, they would use other materials, particularly gold leaf, which is, the name implies, was just that. It was gold leaf that would be burnished in place with an animal horn on occasion. There was extensive preparation to the page. We're, of course, not talking about paper. We're talking about animal skins. It had to be, well, they had to remove the hair from the skin. They had to prepare it, pound it, stretch it, bleach it on some occasions, and all manuscript illumination was incredibly labor intensive in that regard. There was so much prep work that had to be done. You would have, and let's use the monastic model here because it's easier to talk about, I think. You would have monks that just prepared the vellum or the parchment. the various animal skins. You would have those who folded that parchment and sewed those quires, they were called, together. A quire was simply a fold of the parchment, and then it would be sewn. And if you look at nicely prepared books today, we still use that technique. So they would be sewn together. The individual leaves, we still call them folios, and the folios and quires would be sewn together. That had to be incredibly labor intensive. Paints had to be prepared. You couldn't go to a Hobby Lobby, if I can say that, or Michael's, and buy your paints, or Cheap Joe's, or I'll try to advertise everyone here, but you couldn't go to the art supply store. Those had to be ground in, using a mortar and pestle, had to be ground from earth materials, had to be prepared. The gold leaf had to be obtained and prepared. You can often see the red sizing or under glue for the gold leaf showing through. As the manuscript wears wears down, you can see this reddish color. So that had to be done prior to the gold leaf going in place. So you had all this going on long before the scribe begins his work, and even before he can begin, or she can begin copying the text.
Since the scribe wasn't usually the illuminator, it took a team of trained artisans working together to create this finished product. Sometimes this relationship worked. Other times the illuminator had a sense of humor about his art. If you look carefully at the actual illuminations or artwork, you can see they don't always support the message in the text. Several manuscripts give you a feeling of how the artist felt about the subject.
If you look at the little details in the margins, sometimes you will find images that actually undercut what the text is saying. Say, for example, you have a text about speaking against various sins, for example. You might see the sins illustrated by very tiny figures in the margins, but they're illustrated with such gusto that it's hard to tell whether the text, the manuscript part of it itself, is thoroughly accomplishing its goal of arguing against these sins, since the illuminator seems to be kind of recommending them. So that makes the whole thing kind of very interesting to study.
You may have a full-page illumination of the Godhead, or the crucifixion, or the Nativity, or the Annunciation. And what we begin to find as we get into especially the 13th century, are what the French sometimes called drôlerie, or in Latin Marginalia, our word margin, of course, referring to the borders of the image. And you find some things that you really wouldn't expect, and they are quite likely meant to be funny, and at the same time maybe a bit moralizing. Some of these things I can't describe because they need to be censored, and they're a bit of a shock. You have knights, some of the safe imagery, you have mounted knights or whatever beating each other with legs of lamb. Then you have nuns and monks doing things they shouldn't, and a lot of things that, at least to modernize, appear to be a lot of fun. One of the great scholars of that whole thing was a fellow named Michael Camille. He's since passed away, but he wrote some very interesting scholarly text on what goes on in these margins, and I like his approach. He tended to think there was quite a bit more humor, quite a bit more of the tongue-in-cheek than maybe we would even give them credit for. So you bet you have a lot of that, and it's very interesting to leaf through these things and come upon something that can be a bit startling.
And sometimes the artwork had absolutely nothing to do with the text. True to the culture of conspicuous consumption, a lot of the art was added purely to show the grandiose nature of the owner.
Particularly French manuscripts from the high medieval period, say the 14th, 15th centuries, you would have all this beautiful vine work, just vines and flowers, in the margins around the text, simply because it's pretty. But once again, that still feeds into the conspicuous consumption idea, because you've got to pay somebody to do all that. And that's usually just decoration.
The most magnificent examples of illumination can be found in religious manuscripts. Since the highest concentration of literacy in the world at that time was centered around churches and monasteries, it only makes sense that they wrote about what they knew. That's why a majority of the illumination in these early books is about hagiography, or the study of saints. But just because the scribes were religious men doesn't mean the illuminators were familiar with the stories that were being written. In some of the texts, you can actually find notes written in the margins by a religious scholar telling the artist what a saint should look like.
The directions, like a cooking recipe, are in the margins. They'll say things like, well, you read, they don't say anything, of course, but you can read in Latin to that monk, here, place so-and-so and give him or her, give Saint Sebastian arrows in his body, or whatever. And we come out of that realizing the scribe, or better yet, the illuminator, may not be well versed in the iconography. They have to be directed.
Even more surprising, some of the scribes of the era were illiterate themselves. They were only able to copy letters from one page to another, not write manuscripts.
It's interesting also to note that in some cases our scribes weren't necessarily literate. They just knew how to make letters.
However, since the invention of the printing press, illumination has all but died as a major art form, but its influence can still be seen today.
Awards that people might get. Sometimes these things are actually written by a calligrapher by hand. And then you might have someone decorate it. I don't know if you would call that illumination today the way it would be illumination in the Middle Ages, but it's certainly a handwritten text that is decorated. And if we define illumination as decoration, then, well, it's illuminated.
If you just open a textbook or any visual book you buy, you're going to have columns of text. Our textbooks still have multiple columns. Well, they've moved away from that, but traditionally columns of text and images inserted, and in some ways they follow that basic format.
As a matter of fact, a direct descendant of these early manuscripts is probably in front of you right now.
They have these very faint bluish gray lines made with lead. There would be someone who would come along with red ink and establish the left margin, the vertical margin, so that as the quires were sewn together, in some cases they would do this, the illuminator and the scribe would know, because frequently they would work prior to the sewing, or the binding, because they had to be careful of the left margin. And that's interesting because to this day, when I don't have one here, but you pick up a piece of notebook paper, you've got that red line on the left and then your blue reguli, little line. So we still are all monks and scribes.
So when you're doodling while taking notes, don't think of it as wasted time. You're just following the time-honored tradition of illuminating your text. If you're interested in seeing more examples on illumination, check out the British Library's website, which has an extensive collection of illuminated texts online. You can find it by visiting www.bl.uk.